Popular culture aspect of the 1920s. Again, this is what you're going to be primarily researching this week for you folks in DCUS History 107. But with popular culture, the 1920s is basically the era of the rise of celebrities that are not necessarily affiliated with the government. There's just a lot of name dropping in this part. If you're looking to argue things over the 1920s in terms of what's relevant today, obviously you have the politics side and the women's side that I've just previously discussed in these lectures. However, the largest impact on you as an individual, other than what happens as a result of the Great Depression with the reform measures there, but as far as you as an individual, the fact that celebrities rise and media explodes in the 1920s to basically what we have now, with the exceptions of social media and the internet, but in terms of film, books, newspaper, so on and so forth, and radio, it really takes off in the 1920s. And chances are you will have heard of most of these celebrities that I talk about here in just a second. But there's going to be several societal changes that are going to lead to this emphasis on media and celebrities. You're going to have urbanization take off big time in the 1920s, in which cities are going to become extremely massive once again. You have multiple people leaving their farms, tired of the small town life, going to cities to make their fortunes, and you're going to start to see what we call urban sprawl, which is where cities had previously just kind of grown in the downtown areas. Now cities are going to grow out rapidly in all directions. This is not the era where outlying cities become suburbs. That is in the 1950s. But you see those cities begin to start stretching out that way. So when the 1950s, whenever the interstate highway system comes into play, those places are connected at that point in time. But anyway, what winds up happening is people leave these farms, and it's going to wind up creating a very confusing culture for some, because you literally are going to have people who have lived on the farm their entire life, and suddenly they're going to wind up being out in the city, just kind of almost like a sitcom or a bad movie, if you will. So anyway, this confusing culture, basically just think about hillbillies in the city and people starting to recognize there are backwards ways of life that are taking off in these places. So that's basically what I'm talking about with this section, along with the national celebrities that come about as a result of this. Also within this confusing culture, there's a big emphasis, as you know, on scientific method and reasoning leading up to World War I and into the early part of the 1920s. Also a very big emphasis on science within production and things like that. However, religion is going to eventually collide with science in the 1920s, and several people are going to be upset with what is going on in the United States and try to roll back to the way things were. So what I mean by this is, in the United States, a group of Christians known as the fundamentalists, and again, I don't give my religious opinions, and I don't bash religions. I don't support one religion over another. I'm just telling you the way things were. But fundamentalism is basically where you have a translation of the Bible, and everything is to be taken literally within that translation of the Bible. There is no figurative language within the Bible according to the fundamentalists. Okay, what this basically means is, if you are a fundamentalist, and this is just an example, instead of in the book of Genesis, the creation of the world taking 7 days as imagery and being a story that you see as like an interpretation of how the world was formed, fundamentalists see the 7 days of the creation of the world as literally each of these steps took 1 day. And they say it says in the Bible, this is the way it happened. However, if you're not a fundamentalist, you may take that as imagery and see how weeks were formed out of Christianity, things like that. Okay, so Christianity, Judaism, Islam, sorry. But anyway, again, I don't give my opinions on that. I'm just telling you what the fundamentalists believe, so that way it makes more sense to you for your upcoming quiz. Now, during this era, the ultimate highlight of science versus religion takes place in the state of Tennessee whenever a school teacher named John Scopes is going to be persuaded by a group to begin teaching evolution in his classroom. They said, you will be arrested for this because this is a violation of Tennessee state law. And Scopes says, well, if I'm going to be arrested, who's going to cover my legal fees? And there's a group willing to cover his legal fees. So that way, if and when he is arrested, he will not be out any money for this. Okay, but what he's going to do is he's going to teach Darwin's theory of evolution in class one day. He is going to be arrested, and there's going to basically be a circus go on within this town in Tennessee for the violation of teaching evolution in schools. And again, this is against Tennessee state law. I can't remember if I mentioned that or not. But basically, it's going to highlight science and religion being taught in schools and emphasize a separation of this, as well as an embracement of all theories instead of just focusing in on one. Okay, and let me continue the story on John Scopes here for just a second, because there are a couple of people on here that you need to know. John Scopes himself was a teacher. He wound up leaving the teaching profession shortly after this trial. But what did wind up happening is Scopes begins his lecture one day. He is arrested. After he is arrested, a trial lawyer, probably the most famous trial lawyer in the U.S. at that point in time, a guy by the name of Clarence Darrow, is going to come in, and he is going to defend John Scopes on these charges of breaking this law, and emphasize that, or Darrow is going to emphasize that individuals have the right to teach whatever they please in schools, as long as they address all theories. Okay, the prosecution, or the people bringing charges, while there is a local prosecutor that is going to bring the initial charges on this and go up against Darrow, William Jennings Bryan, yes, that guy that lost the presidential election 3 times, is going to show up, and he is going to prosecute. He's going to prosecute John Scopes in this trial. Well, there's basically, like I said, a circus going on in the town. People bring monkeys in. People bring copies and translations of the Bible in. They are selling these. It's just basically a festival-like atmosphere. Trial begins. Scopes is found guilty of violating the law. His sentence, I believe, was a $100 fine. Okay, so nothing big. He didn't have to surrender his teaching license or anything like that. But anyway, the $100 fine is taken care of. Scopes decides to return to work for a short period of time, but eventually is going to leave the teaching profession altogether. And then also there's going to be, right after this trial, William Jennings Bryan is going to return home. He's not going to be feeling very well as a result of this trial, which took place in the middle of the summer, and there's a lot of heat. But after he returns home, he dies a very short time. It's less than a week after he returns home from the trial that he dies. So anyway, just a few interesting things that happen with that. But like I said, this is going to be whenever individuals are going to begin questioning what people teach in schools. Okay, as far as the era with art, there's going to be several aspects of culture that are going to be influenced by this. One is going to be art. Many artists are going to attract rich patrons who are going to commission work, because there's so much money, people are going to want to spend it on things that make them happy and things that are going to get them noticed. Art's one of the best ways to do this. Well, the most popular form of art at this point in time is a style called abstract expressionism, where you make marks and random strokes used to represent things on the art. The most famous individual known for doing this is a guy named Jackson Pollock. And there's some speculation that he was so creative because he had some substance problems and drinking problems. But if you ever take a look at some of his art, which I don't believe is in here, and I apologize for that, I'll throw some up on the website here in just a few minutes for you to take a look at. But he's basically going to drip and throw paint all over canvases and make very texturized forms of art. Salvador Dali, another famous artist during this era, he's going to embrace surrealism. He begins to obtain some fame. Of course, this is a guy that has the melting clocks on or painting that you probably have seen before, but he begins to obtain some fame. His fame really takes off in the 1940s. But again, there's abstract expressionism, and of course surrealism takes off. Music during the era. Jazz is going to be the single most popular format of music, and that is for both races. A secondary one comes about towards the end of the decade called the blues, that I'll talk about here in a second. But jazz is going to become extremely popular among all races, and this is actually going to bridge that divide between the races, because a lot of people, white people, are patrons of African American musicians, want to go see African Americans perform. Case in point, Louis Armstrong, probably the single most influential jazz artist of the era, along with Duke Ellington, are both going to be persuaded, or not persuaded, but both are going to be very popularized by all races during this era. You also have the blues that takes off towards the end of the decade. And again, this takes place in the early 30s, but it just shows the influence of music in the 1920s because blues became popular in places in the South. Out of the blues comes rock. And of course, rock, there's several genres that come with that. But the single most popular blues guitarist at that point in time, the late 20s, early 30s, is a very young man named Robert Johnson. He did die at the age of 27, which he is the first member of the 27 Club, if you've ever heard of that, which is a group of artists or musicians who died at the age of 27. Includes Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse, Jimi Hendrix, people like that. Well, Robert Johnson, not too sure on his death. He may have been poisoned for attempting to steal somebody's girlfriend or wife. But there was this very popular rumor in the South that Robert Johnson was so popular on the guitar that he sold his soul to the devil at the crossroads at midnight in order to obtain his talent. Now, Robert Johnson is also famous for writing Sweet Home Chicago, which you may have heard that song. And there's another song called Hot Tamales and the Red Hot. Both of these have been covered by various people, including the Rolling Stones and the Who and Led Zeppelin. So his talent pretty much goes unrecognized until Eric Clapton begins trying to emphasize, Robert Johnson influenced him as a guitarist and influenced all these other people as guitarists. And there needs to be kind of a shift back to looking at what he did in the late 20s and early 30s. Organized crime is also another very popular or very big part of popular culture. I mentioned Bonnie and Clyde last time. Again, that's early 30s. This is what we call the Public Enemy era that lasts until the 1930s, in which you have Babyface Nelson and people like that go around robbing banks, murdering people. And they're very popularized and sensationalized. You have Public Enemy number one, people that the FBI are seeking out for arrest. But anyway, organized crime, the single most famous person with organized crime during the 1920s has got to be Al Capone of Chicago. Now, Al Capone is famous for killing his competitors and rivals for power. He is also a notorious bootlegger, among various other aspects of his massive crime empire. The first notoriety that he obtains outside of Chicago is on Valentine's Day of 1929. He had allegedly had two of his officials go in, dressed as police officers, to a meeting among the 7 bosses of these rival gangs. And these bosses are lined up on the wall. They think they're going to be arrested. They are shot in the back and massacred on Valentine's Day. And this allowed Capone to seize control basically of the city of Chicago in terms of the various bootlegging and influence on politics and things like that at that point in time. Now, Capone is able to get away with this because he has an airtight alibi in which he is in Florida at his vacation home down there at that point in time. He's never legally connected to the crime. However, his downfall comes in the 1930s as he was known for bootlegging mass quantities of alcohol in the United States from Canada. And he basically flaunted this all over Chicago. Well, the Treasury Department started a task force under the Volstead Act, and this task force became centered out of the city of Chicago and was led by a guy named Eliot Ness. And you may have heard of some of this before. There was a famous movie in the 1980s in which Robert De Niro played Al Capone, and Eliot Ness was played by Kevin Costner. Very historically inaccurate because Eliot Ness and Al Capone never came face to face. And there's a very famous scene in a courtroom between those two in that movie. But anyway, Eliot Ness begins this Treasury Force task force in Chicago with the goal of overthrowing Capone's empire and taking him down on bootlegging and violations of the 18th Amendment. So anyway, his task force becomes known as the Untouchables because they did a lot of questionable tactics. I apologize for this. They had a lot of questionable tactics in terms of getting information out of people, somewhat immoral. but they were untouchable because a lot of other police organizations would not touch them, and every time somebody tried to go after them within the organized crime aspects, they would be taken out by them. So anyway, the downfall for Al Capone comes as Elliot Ness's task force is able to uncover the fact that Capone did not pay income taxes for a period of time and was doctoring his ledgers. So anyway, with that, you're going to have Al Capone wind up in prison at Alcatraz, and he did contract syphilis at some point in time, and basically died in the 1940s, a shell of his former self. But again, most famous gangster of the 1920s. And again, this does start the public enemy era in which the FBI is constantly seeking out people that are robbing banks and causing uprisings in society. And this lasts well into the 1930s. Okay, Prohibition, a very hot button issue during the 1920s. It basically, I don't want to make it sound like it was a joke how people took this law, but just to make clear what the 18th Amendment does and does not do. The 18th Amendment bans the sale and distribution of alcohol. It also bans the manufacturing of it illegally. It did not completely ban the manufacture of alcohol because you had distilleries in Kentucky that were able to operate on a medicinal whiskey license. And I believe there were 5 or 6 distilleries that were able to do that. And people could literally go to their doctor and obtain a prescription for medicinal bourbon whiskey at that point in time. And the joke in Kentucky is, where I used to live there were there was a population of 2 million in the state of Kentucky during the 1920s. There were 4 million, 4 million prescriptions for medicinal whiskey written in the 1920s. Now, the Volstead Act is going to ban, the Volstead Act is going to create that task force within the Treasury Department, such as the Untouchables, to enforce this amendment. A lot of bootlegging actually took place through the U.S. Post Office, and so there were government officials involved. It basically led to more and more crime, extremely difficult to enforce, and they realized that you could tax these various forms of alcohol and regulate it and earn a lot of money off of it. So that's why they got rid of the Volstead Act and the 18th Amendment in 1933 with the 21st Amendment. However, 2 very famous things come out of the 1920s in terms of prohibition, terms that you will need to know. One is a speakeasy, which is an illegal bar where you have to have a password in order to get in. You literally would have a secret knock, usually on a passageway that only a few people knew about. Somebody would take your password and then admit you. The most famous speakeasy I know of around the Missouri Ozarks was actually at Fantastic Caverns in Springfield, which is where the cave where you drive through on a Jeep now. But deep in the heart of Fantastic Caverns was actually a speakeasy where they did sell alcohol in there. You also have bootleggers. These are people who transported alcohol illegally. This is what my great-grandfather actually did as a truck driver in New York. And we still have his bootlegging bottles up in my aunt's house in northern Missouri. But anyway, in South Carolina, you have an element called moonshine. Moonshine is any spirit that you distill, or any type of alcohol you distill on your own, and you do not pay taxes on the manufacturing of that, and you sell it illegally. Well, bootleggers are going to take this illegally produced alcohol, known as moonshine, and they're going to soup up their Ford cars and other cars with supercharged engines and various other elements to help them outrun the sheriff's department in these places. And they literally would race through the mountains. Well, eventually, these people are going to say, well, why don't we race each other out here in the mountains? And then eventually in the 1950s, they're going to decide they're going to go in left-hand turns around a circle down at Daytona Beach, and this is how NASCAR is born. Okay, so anyway, another popular culture thing from the 1920s that you might want to keep in mind. As far as consumer culture goes, as you as an individual, in terms of how people bought and wanted to buy things, gasoline and electricity made your life much, much easier than it had been before. And gas and electricity went into things such as cars, household appliances, washing machines. There were a few dishwashers, irons, things like that. It's going to make life a lot easier than it had been before. Well, people are going to line up to buy these new products, and these products are going to become much more famous as a result of advertising's rise thanks to George Creel's Committee of Public Information, which influences how people look at how to get people to buy things and want more things. So there's lots of posters and advertisements for things all over the place, and people are going to want the latest and the greatest products. You also have automobiles dropping price at this point in time whenever Henry Ford makes his vehicles much more affordable thanks to the assembly line method. It takes less time to produce one, and they come in one color, and that is black. Many people line up to buy one. However, these goods cost money. Not everybody had money. It became extremely easy during the 1920s to buy things on credit and not have a whole lot of collateral to put up in terms of going and saying, well, I'm going to buy this. Here's how much money I have, and here's my background and how I've paid off things in the past. They didn't do all that stuff. Well, you can put down as little money as you wanted on something and pay for it over time through something called installment plans. And like I said, these installment plans, while they are well intended, they did not use credit checks or anything like that, and a lot of people defaulted on these loans, and it was fairly easy to disappear with certain products at that point in time, never to be heard from again, and this is going to hurt multiple businesses during the 1920s, especially towards the onset of the Great Depression. Okay, other popular culture individuals that you need to know moving forward in here for your project, for those of you in DCUS history, and as far as your quiz/test for this unit, in the 1920s, the single most famous celebrity that you can come across is a guy named George Herman, or Babe Ruth. He was a legendary baseball player, and the reason why he became so popular, other than the fact that he smashed pretty much every record baseball had for hitters at that point in time, along with the fact that he originally was a pitcher in his career, is that he is the first athlete to have endorsements. Specifically, he had an endorsement through Wheaties cereal that people thought if they went and ate their Wheaties, they would become like Babe Ruth, and then also through Red Rock Cola, which no longer exists. But these two companies signed him 2 contracts to endorse the products, use his image on advertising, and people flocked to the stores to buy this just so they could be like Babe Ruth. Okay, another famous individual of this era that you need to know is an American hero named Charles Lindbergh. Aboard a plane called the Spirit of St. Louis, because it was assembled in St. Louis, Missouri, he is going to become the first person and win essentially a bet between a newspaper publication or a society. I can't remember which one right now. But he's going to become the first person to fly alone, or the first person to fly, period, across the Atlantic Ocean from New York to Paris. And he collects a several $1,000 prize, becomes a national celebrity, and is very well respected in American society, and becomes quite wealthy, and then has a very tragic turn in his life whenever his young son is kidnapped and murdered, and then also chooses to make a speech in the 1940s saying that Hitler is well intended in what he is doing over in Germany, and Germany should not be an enemy of the American people, which, spoiler alert, that goes over real well with the American people eventually. Another guy you may have heard of, I know in schools that I've taught in the past, they're required to read some of Ernest Hemingway's works, but Ernest Hemingway is a very famous author of the 1920s, writes a lot about fishing, and also he is an author of The Lost Generation, in which men are kind of disoriented with their country and they don't really appreciate what the government does for them all the time, and they question why the government does certain things. And there's basically a lack of pride among these people, but he appeals to them, and he has very, I want to say, intellectual and very artistic abilities within his writing. And this is going to appeal to that lost generation. But a little interesting fact on him, Ernest Hemingway actually got his start as a writer at a Kansas City newspaper, and I believe it was the Kansas City Times, and he actually gets fired because his writing was too elaborate for what typical readers of newspapers were used to. So anyway, and of course Ernest Hemingway, you can still go visit his home down in Key West, Florida, and he has a collection of cats with an extra toe on their foot that still roam around his house. So anyway, another guy of note that you may have seen depicted actually is depicted by Robert Downey Jr. in one film, a guy named Charlie Chaplin. He is the first basically blockbuster actor that is of note. He's very talented, did win some Academy Awards, but he is going to make several movies and films during the 1920s and is a very popular silent film star. And he's going to make basically acting in films an art form in which people begin to specialize in. People begin to specialize in acting as their career. You got another guy named Rudolph Valentino, who is a very famous actor of this era. For lack of a better phrase on this, he was basically seen as the Brad Pitt of the era, basically a heartthrob in film that women would flock to the movie theaters regardless of what film he was playing just to watch him act. Anyway, he also died a very early death as a result of some form of illness that he contracted towards the end of the 1920s. I believe it's appendicitis, if I'm not mistaken. But other significant events and other famous popular cultural things that have an influence in the 1920s. And again, the reason why we're going over all these celebrities, you may be going, what in the world are we doing this for? The reason why we're doing this, there's a very large emphasis on celebrities and famous people in society now, especially here in the United States, and keeping up with entertainment. And entertainment is one of the largest industries in the United States. And you contribute multiple amounts of money to them each year, whether you like it or not. But anyway, these events in the 1920s influence popular culture to become such a large aspect of our culture in the United States, and emphasize what celebrities do and how they are portrayed and upheld in society. So, just case in point, some of the popular culture and how it influences things. 1923, King Tut, who was a very young pharaoh of Egypt, his tomb is going to be discovered over in Egypt. And King Tut was actually not a very significant pharaoh. However, most of the tombs of the pharaohs had been robbed by grave robbers. And as a result of this, we did not have a whole lot of artifacts from ancient Egypt. They were in private collections. However, once King Tut's tomb is opened, people were able to see, like his famous sarcophagus or death mask made out of gold. See basically how they preserved bodies back then, and things they gave to Egyptians for the afterlife. It started this renewed interest in ancient Egypt, and it also started up various cultural fashions, such as women having makeup that depicted somewhat of an Egyptian person in hieroglyphics. They also had haircuts that haircuts that resembled Cleopatra, as well as the dress of the era. Very simplistic emphasis on things that you would typically find within hieroglyphics and over in Egypt, influenced multiple things like this. Okay. Another thing that has an influence on you, the very first Sears store opened up in 1925. While Sears is struggling as a corporation right now, the very first Sears store opening is a big event, because this is going to be seen as the first massive department store in which there's a national chain of them. Many department stores were a one-and-done thing, but Sears is the first one. Again, he got to start as a mail-order catalog, utilizing the telegraph and the railroad. But Richard Sears opens his first store, and people literally will drive from counties over to major cities to go shop at his store and get goods at affordable prices. Okay, and out of Sears comes the ones that we know now that use basically the same model, but are able to evolve their industry and with the times better than Sears did, and that is, of course, Walmart and Amazon. So that this Sears model becomes a model for them. Also in 1925, renewed interest in the weather and concern over science and the environment because of a massive tornado that actually went through parts of Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana. It traveled, was right around 200 miles on the ground, produced EF5 damage to multiple cities, leveled various things, and killed almost 700 people. This is referred to as the Tri-State Tornado. After this, there is a larger emphasis on trying to study the atmosphere and figuring out what causes tornadoes, and how to prevent them, and what to do in the event that a tornado occurs. And it's going to take another event about 50 years after this for people to fully understand what happens with tornadoes. But again, this renews people's interest in the environment as a result of this. Also, 1926, it's a little more culturally relevant now, but it was the first major, I guess, not coast-to-coast highway, but first major U.S. highway to spring up in the United States is Route 66. travels from Chicago to Los Angeles over thousands of miles. And of course, still goes through some of the communities you all live in, particularly Joplin, all the way over to Springfield, Lebanon, goes up to St. Louis, and then, of course, down through Oklahoma as well. So, anyway, also with women, probably there's a few famous women that come out of the 1920s. Very few famous athletes. Babe Dickerson comes to mind. She's a famous golfer. Also dabbled in trying to pitch for baseball for a little bit. Did not actually make it into the big leagues, but Amelia Earhart is basically like the female celebrity of note during the 1920s. That is a non-artist because she flew across the Atlantic, became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic, and then eventually is going to attempt to fly around the world on her plane, and of course is never heard from again along this journey. Okay, another thing that happens in the 1920s in terms of science and people beginning to grasp other things, penicillin is discovered. Penicillin, of course, is a treatment for various infections, and it's a very common treatment for things such as strep throat or just various illnesses that you get that are non-viral. But anyway, penicillin is heavily utilized in preventing infections during World War II and actually saved several lives out on the battlefield. Okay, so that is going to conclude a very long part on culture of the 1920s, and of course we're going to wrap this up with racial issues during the 1920s as well here in just a minute.